evening. Thank you for coming tonight. My name is Anthony Seebach. I am the co-director with Professor Jessica Roth of the Jacob Burns Center for Ethics and the Practice of Law. In 2021, we inaugurated the Jacob Burns Award for Professional Courage. We are giving the award in 2025 to Liz Oyer, the former pardon attorney at the Department of Justice. Liz had a distinguished career, graduating from Harvard Law School. After clerking on the 11th Circuit, she joined Mayor Brown in DC, where she became partner. She left big law to become a federal public defender, and in 2022 was appointed the United States Pardon Attorney. In March of this year, Liz was asked to recommend that Mel Gibson, the actor, be included on a short list of people with criminal convictions who could have their federal gun rights restored. Gibson had lost his right to own a gun after he was convicted of a state domestic violence misdemeanor involving battery of his former girlfriend. Liz refused because of her concern about the safety risks of allowing someone with a record of domestic violence to own a gun, and because she believed that the requested action was not warranted under the rules and traditions that had developed in the Justice Department over many years. A department official tried to convince her to change her mind because Mr. Gibson had a personal relationship with President Trump. She still refused and was fired. Then, when she was called to testify before Congress about her firing, she was threatened by the Justice Department, which planned to send 2 armed marshals to deliver a letter to her at home at night, warning her about the risks of testifying. The purpose of the Burns Center is not only to educate students and lawyers or to promote ethical conduct, but to promote courage as well. Knowing what the rules and law require is not enough. Even harder still is having the courage to do what is right when the time comes to make a choice. Liz acted with courage, and the treatment she has received since her firing from her former employer illustrates the risks that she has assumed and the costs that she has had to bear. Liz, it's with gratitude and humility that we give you this award. Thank you very much.
Oh, great. We'll just have it there between us as a set piece.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
All right. So I'm Jessica Roth, a professor at Cardozo Law School and co-director with my colleague Tony Seebach of the Jacob Burns Center for Ethics and the Practice of Law. I'm also a former federal prosecutor in the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York. So Liz, we are so grateful that you are here. We are so grateful for your example. What I want to do first is provide some context for the actions that Tony just alluded to by talking about the Office of the Pardon Attorney at the Department of Justice, sort of what it is, what it has been historically since I believe it was founded over 130 years ago, and what also a pardon is. Or the Constitution, Article 2 of the Constitution gives the president the power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States. So if you could talk a little bit about the pardon power and the Office of the Pardon Attorney.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much, Jessica and Tony, and to Cardozo for having me and for this incredible honor.
Can people hear her? Can hear? Okay. Is it on? Yeah.
Is that better?
Okay, excellent.
Turn it on.
Okay, great.
I was saying thank you so much to everyone for coming, and thank you, Jessica and Tony, and to everyone at Cardozo for this incredible honor of this award. It's, I didn't do anything that I did with the hope of getting any recognition for it, and so I'm blown away to receive this recognition and really just truly appreciative. So the work of the Office of the Pardon Attorney is probably one of the least understood parts of the Justice Department. I think that there are people who work in the Justice Department who don't actually know that there is an Office of the Pardon Attorney in the Justice Department. And I see one of my former colleagues in the room. Hi, Mark. Yeah.
I'm going to just suggest that you switch your mic to the other side.
Okay.
Put your headphones on, and we're only getting the third. Thanks.
Is that better? Okay. So the Office of the Pardon Attorney is a relatively small office, and it is entrusted with making recommendations about clemency to the president. There are people all around the country who are applying to the president for pardons and commutations, which are both types of clemency under the president's power under the Constitution. Article 2 of the Constitution says that the president can grant clemency to really anybody he chooses for any reason. And pardons are essentially forgiveness for a crime that's been committed in the past. And commutations are a reduction in a sentence of imprisonment. So sort of like a partial version of a pardon where you get released from your sentence early. There are people from all over the country who are incarcerated applying for commutations or who are back in the community applying for pardons, and the office gets thousands of applications per year. The job of the office is to review those applications and make recommendations to the president that are not based on politics or relationships or financial access, but really that are fair and based on principles of justice. So this was a really important job in my view because we have so many laws in this country, some of which have been scaled back that over incarcerate people. And just the fact of having a criminal conviction is something that continues to haunt many people for their entire lives because there are so many collateral consequences that come from these convictions. So for many Americans, a pardon from the president is really a dream come true because it is the only way to fully move past some of those collateral consequences of having a criminal conviction. We took the work very seriously and had really an amazing team of attorneys doing this in the Office of the Pardon Attorney. All of that has changed now. It's a very different landscape in the clemency space and in the Justice Department, but it's really important work that I hope will continue into the future.
So you were a federal public defender before you took office as the pardon attorney. You'd been a federal public defender for 10 years and the only public defender to take the position of being the pardon attorney. You've said it was your dream job. What were your priorities when you came into the position?
It really was a dream job because I, as a public defender, was used to having to beg, plead, grovel for outcomes that felt fair for my clients. And sometimes I just didn't have the tools to achieve those outcomes because of things like mandatory minimum sentencing laws. So the idea of being able to help the president to exercise this power of mercy just really was a dream come true for me. I could see my own clients in so many of the people who were applying for clemency and really wanted to have a role in pushing for a more broad use of the clemency power to correct some of the excesses of criminal sentencing at the federal level. So it really was a tremendous opportunity. And one of the priorities of the office was really to use the clemency power to try to redress some mandatory minimum laws that had resulted in over-incarceration of people for drug offenses primarily. There are many people who have applied for clemency who are serving life sentences and really have no recourse through the courts. So clemency from the president is their only hope of getting out of prison before they die. And those cases are the ones probably that weighed on me the most. We had many people who had been incarcerated for 20 or 30 years or more for drug crimes, for the type of thing that you would think isn't worthy of a life sentence, but that life sentence is mandatory under federal laws. So we saw a lot of those cases, and the work was very heavy, but also very important and meaningful.
Were you a political appointee, and was anybody else in your office a political appointee?
That's a great question. No, the Office of the Pardon Attorney is entirely staffed with career employees of the Justice Department. So I was not appointed by the President, and the expectation was that my work would continue from one administration into the next. The purpose of having a pardon attorney is to ensure that the pardon process is not completely politicized. I'm sure that the pardons that most of you come first to your mind are the ones that are the most political. We saw the pardon of Hunter Biden, which was very controversial in the last administration, and there are many more before it. Bill Clinton pardoned his donor Mark Rich. He pardoned his half-brother. President Ford pardoned Richard Nixon, which was very controversial at the time. We've seen a lot of these types of pardons that I think some people would say give the idea of pardoning a bad name, but the purpose of the pardon attorney is to make sure that it's used to do justice and to do mercy in appropriate cases. And for the most part, by and large, throughout history, that is how the pardon power has been used, although there are some high-profile, notable exceptions.
And to be clear, some of those high-profile examples that people may be familiar with likely bypassed the pardon attorney's office. Is that fair to say?
That's right. Yep. The president is not required to rely on the advice of the pardon attorney in granting a pardon, and this president, the current president, hasn't relied on the pardon attorney's advice at all. Joe Biden relied on the pardon attorney for a lot of the clemencies that he did, but not in the cases of the pardons of his family members, which are something that the president has the prerogative to do, even if they're not recommended by the pardon attorney.
So once Trump was elected in 2024, took office, did you expect to stay on as the pardon attorney?
I very much hoped that I would be able to stay on, and my whole team was really preparing as though we were going to be able to continue the work. We had prepared memos for the incoming administration. We had updated our clemency recommendations, and I was really hopeful that I would be able to continue that work.
And I gather things changed pretty quickly. Can you talk a little bit about how things changed right after the new administration took office?
Yeah, they did change very quickly. Immediately, the office was really sidelined from the clemency review process. We were told that the White House was going to be making decisions about clemency without consulting the Justice Department, and our role was going to be minimal or non-existent as far as the clemency piece of it went, and that was reflected in the pardon of the January 6th rioters, which happened on the first day of the new administration. I learned about it from a news alert on my phone like the rest of the country. It's not something that I had been involved in at all or had even any advance warning about, and that was sort of a sign that things were changing. And then the president continued to pardon people without any forewarning to the Justice Department that these pardons were coming. And one thing that was really surprising to see is that in many cases the pardons were granted to people that the Justice Department was actively still prosecuting. Typically, the Justice Department would be consulted to seek their views about whether a pardon is appropriate, and typically pardons are granted to people who have already been prosecuted, served their sentence, done their time, paid their debt, and have moved forward with their life. And this president took a very different approach and began granting pardons to people who were still being prosecuted by his own Justice Department, which created a huge amount of confusion, to say the least. Then we were sort of tasked with taking our work in a different direction. The Attorney General launched an initiative to begin using a statutory power that she has that has not been used for many decades, which is to restore the right to possess a gun for people who have lost their right to possess a firearm due to a criminal conviction. There's a federal law that says that if you have a felony conviction or if you have a misdemeanor domestic violence conviction, you no longer can legally purchase a firearm. So it was a priority for the Attorney General, I was told, to reinvigorate this statutory framework for restoring gun rights to people with criminal convictions, and that process was going to be run through my office, to my great surprise.
And I gathered that was not a function that your office had previously served?
No. Pardons under federal law do have the effect of restoring your right to possess a gun, but that's sort of incidental to the pardon. It's not, for most people, why they're seeking a pardon. And this idea of just purely looking at cases to determine whether the Attorney General should restore someone's gun rights or not something that the office had ever done before.
And so once it had been communicated to you that this was a priority of this administration, Did you and your staff start compiling a list of people who were candidates, in your view, for the restoration of their gun rights?
Yeah, we were asked to come up with a list of people who the Attorney General could grant this type of relief to. And the only way I knew to do that was to look at the people who'd applied for pardons and see were some of them seeking pardons, at least in part because they wanted to regain their gun rights, which some were. And many of those folks had been fully vetted and investigated, which is a part of the pardon process. You go through an extensive background investigation. The FBI actually comes out and speaks to you and knocks on your neighbor's doors and the whole works. So we had some people who had been fully vetted for pardons, who we were recommending for pardons, and those people had stated somewhere in their application that they were interested in getting their gun rights back. In many cases, in most cases, people would say something like, I'd like to be able to take my grandchildren hunting, stuff like that. So, we came up with a list of folks who fell in that category and were able to recommend some candidates.
Was Mel Gibson on that list that you
He
came
was
up
not.
with?
He was not on that list. The criteria that we were using were really people who had committed nonviolent crimes where we were persuaded that if they were to regain their gun rights, they would not present any danger to public safety. So they tended to be people with very low-level crimes, mostly financial crimes or low-level drug crimes that had occurred in the distant past. Most of these were folks whose criminal convictions were 20-plus years in the past and who had really demonstrated exemplary rehabilitation in the time since their conviction.
So how did Mel Gibson's name sort of enter the conversation about this list?
Yeah, so I was just asked to add Mel Gibson to the list, to my recommendation to the Attorney General by someone in the Office of the Deputy Attorney General. And at the time, really all I knew about Mel Gibson was what I'd seen on TMZ. I don't know if TMZ even still exists for those of you young folks, but his mugshot was blasted up there after he was arrested for drunk driving, and then again after he was arrested for abusing his ex-romantic partner. And, I knew him from a few movies, and I knew that Donald Trump had made him an ambassador to Hollywood, which is not a real ambassadorship, but something that does now have a title. And that was it. So I didn't have the type of information that I had about all these other candidates to suggest rehabilitation, demonstration of remorse for the underlying conduct, investigation. I didn't have any of that. I really just had the fact that he was a friend of the president.
And so what did you do, given that the request had been made to you and you didn't have the information you thought you needed to, consistent with your professional judgment, make the requested recommendation?
So I was a little slow to catch on to how important this was. And initially I just said, well, no. I mean, why would I recommend that this person get his gun rights back? He's somebody with a domestic violence history. Domestic violence, when linked with firearms, tends to be much more dangerous. There's a lot of data that shows that domestic violence incidents are much more likely to be fatal if the abuser has a firearm. So there was simply no way that I would recommend someone with a domestic violence history to regain their gun rights, and certainly not without some thorough background investigation to show that that person could safely possess a firearm. So I said no without really giving it a lot of thought until I was asked again. I was asked, is your position flexible? And I was told that this person was a friend of the president. He had a personal relationship with the president, and that really should be all I needed to know to make this recommendation that he should get his gun rights back. And the tone of the conversations shifted to a degree that I was acutely aware that this was very consequential for my future at the Department of Justice, that if I was not able to fulfill this request, it wasn't asking me what I thought. It was a request that I do something. And if I wasn't able to do what was being asked, that was likely to be very consequential for my future at the Justice Department. One thing that was happening at that time in the Justice Department is that career experts who were not readily demonstrating that they could get on board with the political agenda of the incoming administration were being sidelined. So, you wouldn't be asked to the next meeting if they didn't like what you said in the one before. And my concern initially was that maybe I would somehow just be sidelined from the conversations. And on one level, that would have been fine with me because I did not go to the Justice Department to work on restoring gun rights. But I had a staff of 45 people who were depending on me to keep the office afloat during an incredibly tumultuous time. These are people, many of whom are single parents who are bringing in the only income for a family, people whose kids rely on federal health insurance benefits. And we had just gotten this fork in the road email from Elon Musk saying, you know, you should think about taking this buyout. There are going to be layoffs coming. We're getting flooded with emails from the leadership of the department saying, send us your names of your employees by seniority because there are probably going to be rifts, reductions in force coming. People are going to be laid off. The budgets are going to be cut. So everyone is in a panic, and everyone is thinking, well, if we're not doing clemency work, how are we going to keep our jobs? We're all going to be fired. So I'm thinking, well, I don't want to get sidelined from these conversations because I want to be able to keep this work stream for my team so that everyone will keep their jobs. And it just became clear to me that I was at risk of losing all of that. And then I did.
So how did you become aware that you had in fact been fired after you refused to acquiesce?
So on a Thursday, I had sent this communication saying essentially, I cannot make this recommendation. And I got a call late Thursday from someone who was really twisting my arm to get me to change my mind. And it was a very unpleasant conversation. I sent my deputy a message asking her after I had this conversation, is Mel Gibson going to be my downfall? Because it suddenly seemed very clear to me that this was very serious. And I didn't sleep at all that night. I deliberated about what to do about it. And I came into the office the next morning and I decided I would try to find a way to thread the needle by not recommending anyone and just saying, here's the list of people that we vetted, and here's Mel Gibson, and here's what we know about him, and essentially you have the power to grant all these people your gun rights back if you want to. I sort of revised my memo to the Attorney General to make it not a recommendation and to include all the names, and I hoped maybe that could thread the needle. And that was around 9 o'clock in the morning that I sent that off. And then that afternoon, I was in a meeting in a conference room with the same guy that I'd been talking to about the Mel Gibson issue repeatedly. He was also leading this meeting of a different working group in the Department of Justice. That was probably even less pleasant to work on than the gun one. And there were probably about 25 people in this meeting, and my deputy came into the meeting and told me, get your bag, you have to leave now. And in the hallway, she told me that there were security guards in my office waiting to escort me out of the building and that I had been fired. So I think I was in shock, and I actually had to drive back to my office because I was in a different building from where my physical office is located. And I got there and the security guards were waiting for me. They handed me a one-page memo that said I was being fired under Article 2 of the Constitution, which is just like the executive authority of the president without any specific reason. And I was told that I needed to leave my badge and my computer and my phone and pack up my stuff, and that was it. So I put my belongings into a grocery bag and I was walked out of the building in front of my entire staff. People were crying, people were in shock, and that was the last time I set foot inside the Department of Justice.
To this day, have you been provided with any reason for your termination other than Article 2?
No, I've never been provided a reason for my firing. When I spoke up about the circumstances that led up to my firing, the Deputy Attorney General, Todd Blanche, said that I was lying. I said that I was lying about the reasons that I was fired. But he didn't ever explain, and still hasn't explained, why I was fired if that wasn't the reason.
And what has been the impact on you and your family of your termination?
Well, it was a very scary and upsetting time. It became even scarier when I agreed to testify before Congress about the circumstances of my firing. And that testimony was scheduled to take place on a Monday. The Friday night before the testimony, I had taken my husband and I took my parents to see a dance performance at the Kennedy Center. It was actually a really terrible performance. And we were leaving at about 9:15 that evening, and I saw that I had a missed call from a Justice Department phone number. And at that point, it had been a couple weeks since I'd been fired, so I thought it was odd that someone from DOJ had called me at 9 o'clock at night. I called back immediately, and it was the head of DOJ's security services who was calling to tell me that there were armed deputy U.S. Marshals on their way to my home, that they had been instructed to arrive there between 9 and 10 p.m., and that they were delivering me a letter that warned me about the risks of testifying before Congress. And he said to me, he said, I just had to call you because this isn't right. He said, you know, these guys are not couriers, they're armed law enforcement officers, and I know that this is going to be really scary and upsetting to you and your family if they show up at your home at 10 o'clock at night, and they're on their way right now. So I'm not home, and the only person home is my 16-year-old, and he, you know, he's a teenager, but still, like, if these people showed up on my doorstep, I think that he would have thought that something horrible had happened to his parents. So I told this man that my son was home alone and that I didn't think I could get back home before they arrived, and he was like, okay, I'm gonna help you figure out how to solve this. And he made some phone calls, and I don't know what he did, but he was able to get them to turn around and not go to my house. And I am incredibly grateful to this day to him for that. I mean, he really went out on a limb to help me to do something that he wasn't supposed to be doing just because he's a decent person. So it's nice to know that there are decent people left in that organization who don't want to see people traumatized by the current leadership.
So notwithstanding everything that had happened until that point, including that Friday night attempt to serve you with this letter from DOJ by armed marshals to your home, you went ahead and testified on Monday before Monday before Congress.
Yeah.
Was that a difficult decision?
It was scary, but no, it wasn't a difficult decision. I don't like to be bullied, and I didn't want to set the precedent that these intimidation tactics could work. So it was not a difficult decision to go forward with the testimony, but it was difficult to get up there and do it because I felt very exposed. I have never felt so exposed in my entire life as I did when I was sitting there telling my story on C-SPAN. And what added to it is after I got this letter, so I eventually did get the letter, even though the marshals didn't come to my home, and it was telling me, you know, you're violating this and that and the other thing if you go forward and testify. So then I decided I needed to find a lawyer. And my husband is also a lawyer, and we know a lot of lawyers. We live in Washington, D.C., which is full of lawyers. We spent the entire weekend on the phone calling everybody that we knew at every law firm and organization in D.C., and I could not find anybody who would represent me because at that point, everyone was terrified of getting crosswise with the current administration. This was when the law firms were getting these executive orders, and so they're all saying, like, oh gosh, this is so terrible, what's happening to you, we're so sorry, like if there's any help you need behind the scenes, please let us know. I'm like, I need somebody to write the Deputy Attorney General a letter and tell him that he's wrong and I'm right, and I need somebody who's going to come to this hearing with me. And eventually I found a lawyer who agreed to do it, and then he called me at 9 o'clock the Sunday night before the testimony and told me that his law firm had found out that he'd agreed to do it and they were telling him he couldn't. And to his credit, he decided to go on his own and continue representing me without his firm's name associated with it, and they tolerated that. And so I did have a lawyer that was there with me at the hearing, but I felt even lonelier and more exposed when I called, you know, lawyers that I have personal relationships with, and they're telling me, no, we just can't get involved.
Was there anything in your own background and professional experience that you think helped prepare you for this moment in particular and gave you the courage to go forward?
Yeah, absolutely. I think being a public defender played a huge role in how I responded to this situation. I was trained to use my voice to stand up for what's right. That's what a public defender does on behalf of clients, and it's sort of how we're trained and how we're wired, and that came naturally to me. And it's very different from how prosecutors are trained, I think. Many of my colleagues at the Justice Department who were fired or reassigned to menial jobs walked away from really long careers at DOJ quietly without speaking up. And I think that's because prosecutors are generally taught your work speaks for itself. You don't speak outside the hierarchy. You don't speak out of turn. You don't criticize what the leadership is doing. And so people were mostly very quiet. But for me, I never had a job where the institutional authority was on my side. I was always sort of working to push back against the institutional authority of the Justice Department as a public defender. And so I was used to having to work for it, and that's what I decided to do here.
You have filed suit against the Department of Justice.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that litigation and what you're seeking through that and what the department's position has been in response?
Yeah, the Department of Justice has become kind of the bane of my existence since they fired me. They've just made it very hard. It took me in the beginning almost a month to get information about the continuation of my health insurance benefits, just basic stuff that I needed to figure out how my family was going to navigate. They've just been stonewalling everything from the beginning, including stuff like that. And so I did file an appeal of my termination. My firing was clearly illegal under civil service laws, which say that someone in a position like mine cannot be fired without cause and cannot be fired in retaliation for protected whistleblowing. So it should be a no-brainer, but the Department of Justice is actively trying to sabotage the protections for non-political civil servants by refusing to participate in good faith in these administrative proceedings. And so the whole system has really kind of ground to a halt. They have fired so many people are appealing illegal firings, and they're doing everything they can to drag their heels and make sure the process doesn't work, that it really has been very ineffectual. I don't know anybody who's actually gotten relief through this process. I've also filed a lawsuit under the Freedom of Information Act to try to get the documents that show that everything that I have said publicly about my firing is truthful. I decided to pursue that after the Deputy Attorney General accused me of lying about the reasons for my firing. I was like, well, I know what all these emails look like, and so I'd like to get copies of them. But they won't give me those. They've been dragging their feet on that as well. They are claiming that they're just overloaded and too busy to respond to my request, which really is seeking probably about 20 pages of documents, so it wouldn't take very long. And in the meantime, the person who has replaced me in my old job is actually rifling through emails that I sent while I was at the department and leaking the ones that he thinks look negative about the Biden administration to the press. So they've got plenty of time to do that, but they can't look for the 20 pages of documents that I am requesting. It's been really wild to see. This guy, Ed Martin, is really a political operative who now has the job of pardon attorney. He's somebody who was a big defender of the January 6th rioters. He has compared January 6th to Mardi Gras in Washington, D.C., and he was originally nominated to be the U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia, which is the chief federal prosecutor. And his views are so extreme that the Republicans in the Senate made it clear that they were not going to vote to confirm him. So now he has landed in my old job, and he literally sits in my old office, and he's literally reading my old emails. And there are emails where I have was at the time critical of things that the last administration was doing, because my job wasn't to be a political lackey. It was to give my independent advice and opinion. And he is leaking those out to the press and refusing to respond to my requests for the documents that I'm entitled to under the Freedom of Information Act. It's just like the world has turned upside down.
Yeah. And so Ed Martin not only holds your former position, but also head something called the Weaponization Working Group within the Department of Justice, where he has announced investigations of political opponents of the president, including Senator Adam Schiff and New York's Attorney General Letitia James.
Yep.
So he's serving in both of those capacities. You've already touched on some of the ways in which he is carrying out his responsibilities very differently.
Yeah. He's got these two different jobs, which show they sort of epitomize the way the Justice Department is being used in the current administration. He, on the one hand, is responsible for making pardon recommendations, but on the other hand, he's got this Director of Weaponization title, and he is the one who's responsible for these politically motivated criminal investigations against people who are enemies or political rivals of the president. So he's digging into the people that you mentioned, Adam Schiff, Letitia James, the woman who's the Federal Reserve Board governor, Elisa Cook, who the president wants fired. He's investigating all of these people. It has become a justice system of punishment and rewards. Punishment for people who are not loyal to the president politically, who are not his allies, and then rewards for people who are supporters and donors to the president. And that's how pardons have been doled out largely. They've been given under this administration either to people who are big MAGA boosters and who have shown political loyalty to the president, or to people who've been able to pay tremendous sums of money, 7 figures, to be able to access lobbyists and lawyers with connections to the president or make donations to the political interests of the president to get pardons.
And there are some costs of some of those pardons that may be hidden to some folks as well that you've talked about, because when people are granted a pardon or clemency, fines and restitution also may go away. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because people may not be aware of that aspect of it as well.
Absolutely. So when somebody gets a pardon, it wipes out any remaining financial obligations that were part of the sentence. So usually when we vet people for pardons, we look for people who've paid any obligations they have to their victims. One of the requirements under federal sentencing laws is that you pay what's called restitution. So if you stole money, you have to repay the money as part of your sentence. The president has been granting pardons to people who haven't even started serving their sentence yet and who haven't started repaying their debts. And I've looked at all of these closely and done some calculations, and he has forgiven over $1.3 billion with a B, dollars in debt that's owed to taxpayers and victims of crime by people who have committed largely financial frauds. One example of this is there's a guy named Trevor Milton who set up a company that was supposedly going to build the world's first electric-powered semi-truck, and the whole company was a fraud. They did this promotional video that supposedly showed a working prototype of the truck, and it turned out that they had actually rolled this truck down a hill and that it didn't work at all. And he stole from his investors over $600 million. There are people who lost their retirement funds investing with him. And before he served a day of his sentence or paid back $1 of his restitution, Donald Trump granted him a full pardon, which wipes out the entire $600 million plus debt that he owes to the victims of his crime. How did he get that pardon? Well, he and his wife donated $2 million to the president's campaign, and shortly after doing that, he got a full pardon. There's another man named Paul Walsack, who was a healthcare executive in Florida, and he was skimming money off the tops of the paychecks of the doctors and nurses that he employed. He used the money to buy a yacht. He was sentenced to prison time and to pay back the money, and again, before he served a day in jail, his mother attended a $1 million a plate dinner at Mar-a-Lago with the president, and then days later, he got a full pardon. So that's how the pardon system is working now, which is very different from the way it was intended.
Shortly after she took office, Attorney General Pam Bondi issued a memo. She issued many, but among them was one that directed all of the employees of the Department of Justice that they worked for the president, reminding them of that, and specifically telling the lawyers that they were the president's lawyers. And that they had a duty to represent the president's interests effectively, zealously. How do you think about the Department of Justice lawyers' responsibilities? Are they the president's lawyers?
That is not how I ever thought of my job, and it's not how any colleague of mine ever thought about their job. We were there to serve the American people. Our duty was to uphold the Constitution and to serve our fellow citizens. It's not to serve the president. The idea that the president actually came to the Justice Department with the Attorney General and announced that he's the chief law enforcement officer in our country. That's really, it's really pretty shocking. There's supposed to be a degree of independence between the Justice Department and the White House. There intentionally has been really since Watergate, and that has totally disappeared. The president is really just pulling the strings of the leadership of the Department of Justice. There's no independence to what they're doing any longer.
So it's been 6 months since
Yep.
you were terminated. You have established an independent media company called Oyer, through which you have established platforms on social media sites like TikTok, Instagram, and others, and you post short videos on contemporary legal issues. They are excellent. I recommend them to all of you. What's your goal with that platform that you've established?
It's really just educational. It's definitely not financial. I have not tried to monetize any of it at all. I think that there are a lot of people who are realizing in this moment that having some basic understanding of legal issues is more important than ever, as we're seeing many of our legal structures that we've taken for granted and many of our rights erode in front of our eyes. People want to understand, what is the law? Is this really allowed? And I'm trying to educate people about some of the things that are happening in the Justice Department and in the pardon space in particular, the areas where I have the most knowledge, by making these videos for social media, and I've got a Substack as well. I will tell you, like, this is the era for me of being brave and trying new things, and getting on TikTok was not something that in my wildest dreams I would have thought 6 months ago that I would do. I thought, like, TikTok is for young people. I'm way too old for that. But I have a younger cousin who really pushed me to do it, who was like, you really should just give this a try. People are going to be interested in what you have to say. And I was like, that's stupid. That's crazy. And then the next thing I knew, one of the videos I did about the pardons got like over 1 million views, and I had all these followers, and I was like, oh yeah, I guess it's good to listen to young people.
That's great. So I want to make some time for questions. Tony, have you been able to?
Yeah, we have some
assemble?
questions,
Okay.
and if you use the QR code, please feel free to shoot me some questions here. I have some to ask you
Yeah,
from
great.
the audience. I'm going to start by batching 2 questions together, which are kind of similar. They are, I'm going to read them out loud, but they are right in order. Looking back on it, was it worth it? Do you believe that you would have handled anything differently if you were faced with the same circumstances today? And the second question, which is related, is at this juncture, in retrospect, how do you assess your attempt to thread the needle? Are you comfortable with the effort looking back on it, or do you think you should have spoken out against restoring Gibson's guns rights at the time? Spoken out, I don't know, means publicly, I guess.
Yeah, so in terms of regrets, I really don't have any. What I would say to all of the younger folks in this room is, once you compromise your integrity, you cannot get it back. And for me, I walked away from this situation with my integrity intact, and I couldn't live with myself otherwise. So there's nothing I would have changed. I felt horribly for my team. I felt for the people who had to go back into the office that Monday after watching me get walked out the door by security on Friday. I felt worse for them than I did for myself, because nobody explained it to them, and nobody knew why this had happened. It just made everyone more afraid than they already were, and they had to continue working there every day. So that was a harder position to be in than the one that I was in. I don't think there's anything more that I could have done to salvage the situation or to protect my team than what I did. And honestly, there was a big sense of relief when I was fired, because I was determined not to quit. I felt like I had to stick it out for the benefit of my team. These were mostly people that I had hired and brought to the Justice Department. And I felt like I owed it to them to stay as long as I could. And when someone took the decision out of my hands and fired me, there was certainly a sense of relief on some level.
Okay, so a question here, it's very specific, but it'd be interesting, to get the answer. What journalist, if any, is doing sustained investigative reporting on the corruption of the pardon process that you've described?
So actually the best coverage on this issue is coming from Bloomberg Law, which is kind of a niche outlet, but they have done some deep dive investigative work on the pardon economy is the term that one of the authors coined. And she's really impressive, this woman, Ava Benny Morrison. I asked her to participate on a panel with me coming up next week about pardons, because she now knows more than I think anybody in America about how you actually get a pardon, because she's spoken with all of these lawyers who are charging these huge fees and have been successful in getting their clients' cases in front of the president. So Bloomberg Law is what I would recommend. The New York Times is also doing some coverage of it, but I think Bloomberg is the best source.
Can you speak more on your testimony before Congress? Was there any sort of outcome, or will there be?
No, the hearing that I participated in was what was called a bicameral spotlight hearing among the Democrats. So the Democrats in the House and the Senate on the Judiciary Committee got together to hold this hearing. They don't actually have any oversight authority over the Justice Department right now because they're the minority party and the Republicans are not interested in doing this. So I have tried my best to persuade everyone who will listen that this is not a partisan issue, that the Republicans on the Hill should be equally alarmed about what is going on in the Justice Department. But thus far, that has not had any effect, and it doesn't seem like any action is going to be taken in the near future.
Okay, so question here, and I'm going to add my own question to this question, is you mentioned how your office was repurposed to focus on gun rights in this specific order you got. Among your former colleagues at the DOJ, how many of them are seeing this type of shift in their work? Does that question make sense to you? Yeah.
In
Okay,
terms
I wanna
of
ask
what they're doing now?
Yeah, I want to ask a follow-up question, which is it's a detailed question. So I'm assuming that Mel Gibson got his gun rights restored, right?
Yep,
Okay.
he did.
Yeah. And I guess my question is, you were fired, but were you fired because you refused to deliver something to the Attorney General, like a recommendation, or were you fired because they discovered in the process of asking for this that they didn't like you anymore, or that you were one of those people who spoke up at the last meeting, they don't want you at the next meeting? I guess my question is really specifically, just like the president doesn't need you to do anything to pardon somebody, the Attorney General didn't need you to do anything to restore his gun rights, right? So why did they even ask you?
Yeah, that's a great question. One thing that is going on in the Justice Department now is they are using career experts, non-political appointees, to try to give a veneer of legitimacy to decisions that are really just political transactions. And that's what was happening here. Nobody needed me to recommend anything because the Attorney General could grant Mel Gibson his gun rights back without my recommendation. And in fact, she did go ahead and do that after I was fired. But she wanted me to recommend it. The leadership of the department wanted me to recommend it because then it looks legitimate. Then it looks like it's not just a favor for a friend of the president. It's something that a career nonpartisan expert is recommending that we do. And that was the purpose, I believe, of getting me involved in the first place.
And so now I want to make sure the question I started with is also addressed, which is, can you describe, do you see similar things in DOJ, similar kinds of shifts? I mean, the suggestion being that, your suggestion was, that never before had DOJ decided to focus on restoring gun rights. That's clearly a partisan, right? I guess I would say, could you imagine a Liz Warren administration having a similar kind of partisan shift? I mean, do you see this happening now in the right-wing shift in other parts of DOJ?
The shift that's happening right now in terms of the priorities of the Department of Justice is unprecedented in how substantial it is. Every time the administration changes from a Democrat presidency to a Republican presidency, there are changes around the margin in terms of priorities and policies. But the wholesale shift of how we even think about the work of the Justice Department is like nothing that I think anyone who currently works there has ever seen before, including some of the folks who have been there for their entire lengthy careers. As a result of the shift that's happened, a lot of experienced people have left, some involuntarily and some voluntarily. My old office has really been decimated. There are very few people that I hired who are still there. The office is down to maybe a third of its former size. And that's happened in other divisions of the Justice Department as well. The Civil Rights Division, which is entrusted with upholding civil rights laws in this country, has lost, I think it's something like 2/3 or 3/4 of its attorney staff. Hundreds of people have left. And this is happening all throughout the Justice Department, which puts us in a situation where we don't have career experts in key roles anymore. And one fear that I have is that we're not paying enough attention to that, and it's going to take something really terrible happening before we see how catastrophic the decimation of the career workforce of the Justice Department is going to be for all of us.
So I have a follow-up question on that, which Jessica's probably going to laugh at me because it'll show how little I understand about prosecutorial discretion, but I do teach it in professional responsibility. I understand that prosecutorial discretion is relatively unfettered, and it basically is very broad. But my understanding as well is that, obviously prosecutors can't be bribed. There's something wrong with that, and maybe even in violation of the law. But I'm also assuming that in state and federal prosecutorial decisions, they can't explicitly refer to political considerations for their prosecutorial discretion. They can say things like, we don't have the resources, but not this person is a donor in the decision not to charge.
Right.
Do you think that this administration will go beyond that line and say openly, in fact, not just we're going to give pardons and commutations because of our political rewards, but we're going to actually explicitly not charge someone because of our political concerns, our political favoritism? Could they do that?
That is absolutely happening right now in the Department of Justice, that people are not being charged or charges are being dismissed because of political relationships. They're not saying that that's why it's happening, but it's clearly happening. There are so many examples of it. The president is appointing these loyalists as U.S. attorneys throughout the country, and the U.S. attorneys are dropping cases that have been pending for a long period of time because the people who they're prosecuting have relationships with the president. The president is dismissing charges against people who show that they're willing to play along in a quid pro quo. We saw that happen with the case of Eric Adams, the mayor of New York City, who now is being considered apparently for a role in the Trump administration in exchange for dropping out of the mayoral race. It's really just, it's very corrupt, and I don't say that lightly. Corruption, I feel like, is a word that's been overused so much in recent years and kind of flung back and forth between parties. But I actually had to look up what corruption means to really convince myself that this is corruption. But using official power that is entrusted to you as part of your office for personal gain, for private gain, whether it's financial gain or political gain, is the definition of corruption. And that is happening throughout the Justice Department at a scale that is really shocking.
So I'm going to bundle two questions together as the final questions, I think. So here they are. Again, they're versions of each other. What hope do you have for the DOJ? Do you still have faith in our judicial system? Why? And then in the modern and frightening landscape, in the modern frightening landscape within the Justice Department and the country at large, what gives you hope?
So as far as the Justice Department is concerned, I didn't come up in that system, and so I came in there thinking there's a whole lot of things about the DOJ that should change. And I was coming from the perspective of a public defender, so the things that I thought should change are not the things that are changing now. But I do think that this is an opportunity for rethinking of our justice system as a whole. One thing that I think has really changed is previously, we were all on the same page about at least striving for a system of justice that is fair and equal, where everyone is treated equally. We've never achieved that ideal. It's always been the case that people with more money can pay for legal representation and treatment that's better than what you might get if you don't have money, and that's always been a fact. But we have always agreed that we should be striving for a system of justice that treats people equally before the law. That is no longer what this administration is striving for. They're perfectly fine with a system of justice that treats people differently based on their politics and based on their wealth. And I think that we are going to have to rethink our justice system and rebuild our justice system after this administration comes to an end, and there is an opportunity to build it back stronger and to get closer to that ideal of a justice system that actually does treat people equally regardless of wealth or politics or family or where you grew up. So I'm trying to look at this moment as an opportunity, and that is what's giving me hope. I want to be part of the rebuilding process, and I think we're going to need younger people who are energized and ready to get in there and make change when this period of time comes to an end.
Jessica, do you want to give us some final words of hope?
Oh, I think that's very optimistic. I love that you ended on that, and I hope that our students who are here tonight will take that message and think about how to get prepared for that moment. I share many of your diagnoses of what's happening now, but I am going to aspire to share your optimism about what can come out of it. But I want to thank you for coming here tonight and sharing your experience and your wisdom, and providing us with such a wonderful example of professional ethics and courage.
Thank you so much. I'm really honored to be here, and thank you all for coming and listening.